The gun barrel pressed against Leo's temple as his father walked past without looking down. That was the moment the project understood its true purpose. Not to be loved, but to be discarded. 13 hours earlier, the evening had begun like every other suffocating dinner at the Sterling estate. Leo's hand, knuckles white, gripped the heavy silver dessert spoon. He stared at his reflection in the polished mahogany table, watching himself fracture and reform with each flicker of the crystal chandelier above. The half-eaten sea bass on his white china plate had gone cold an hour ago. His shoulders hunched forward, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Above his lip, a bead of sweat had formed despite the chill that always seemed to live in this dining room. The methodical clinking of silverware against porcelain continued around him. Outside, the wind roared, and he could hear rain beginning to lash against the windows with increasing violence. A storm was coming, though Leo couldn't tell if he meant the weather or something else entirely. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the table, his face carved from old money and older cruelty. His voice, when it came, was cold and authoritative, the voice of a man who had never been contradicted and saw no reason why he should be now. "The Sterling legacy is a fortress, Leo," Arthur said, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "We don't have room for hobbies like your little photography venture." The word hobbies hung in the air like a curse. Leo didn't respond. He had learned long ago that speaking only prolonged the pain. Instead, he watched his father reach for the bottle of 1982 Bordeaux sitting in its silver cradle. Arthur poured a glass with the careful ceremony of a man conducting a religious ritual. But when he was finished, he set the bottle down with a sharp thud that resonated through the table like a judgment. The wine went to Julian's glass. Leo's remained empty. Julian, Leo's older brother, smiled that particular smile that had tormented Leo since childhood. It was the smile of someone standing on solid ground while watching another person drown. "Don't be too hard on him, Father," Julian said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Some people just aren't built for the boardroom." Eleanor, their mother, adjusted her 3-strand pearl necklace. Her fingers trembled as she did. She had been trembling for years now, Leo noticed. Small, almost imperceptible movements that only became visible when you had spent your entire life studying your mother's face, trying to read in her expressions some sign that she saw him, truly saw him. The diamond rings on her hands caught the light as she clasped them together. She still wouldn't look at him directly. "Leo, dear," Eleanor said, her voice carrying that brittle quality it had taken on in recent years. "Just apologize and tell your father you've sold that camera. It's for the best." The camera, his one possession that didn't belong to them, the one thing he had bought with money earned doing something he actually loved. It sat in his studio apartment across town, waiting for him, the one true friend he had left. Leo stared at the spoon in his hand. When had his knuckles gotten so white? When had the tremor in his hand become so pronounced? He dropped the spoon. It struck the plate with a loud clack that seemed to echo through the entire room. Every face turned toward him. Leo stood up abruptly, his chair legs screeching against the parquet floor with a sound like an animal's scream. He grabbed his leather jacket from the back of the chair. "I'm not a part of this fortress," he said quietly, his voice shaking with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I'm just the prisoner." Behind him, Arthur's fist came down on the table. The impact was tremendous, sending wine glasses jumping, their contents sloshing over the edges and onto the white tablecloth, spreading like blood across fabric. "Walk out that door, and you're no son of mine," Arthur bellowed, his voice reaching a volume that seemed to shake the walls themselves. But Leo was already turning his back to the table, already walking toward the double oak doors with their brass handles. He didn't run. He had learned that running only made them angrier. Instead, he moved with stiff, robotic strides, each step precise and deliberate. He could feel Arthur's rage behind him like heat from a fire, but he didn't turn around. He reached the doors. His hand was on the brass handle when the grand foyer of the Sterling estate was marble and shadow. Ancestral portraits lined the walls, faces of dead Sterlings watching over the living with expressions of permanent disappointment. A bust of a Roman emperor stood on a pedestal near the front door, its face worn smooth by time. Julian caught him there. Leo felt his brother's grip on his left shoulder before he saw him, a violent hand spinning him around and slamming him hard against the marble bust. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. He gasped, seeing stars at the edges of his vision. Julian's face was inches from his own, twisted with the kind of rage that only a favored son denied something could muster. His expensive silk tie flapped against Leo's chest as he leaned in. "Where do you think you're going, little brother?" Julian's voice was vicious, low. "The drama hasn't finished yet." Leo shoved him back, his palms connecting hard with Julian's chest. Julian stumbled, his heels clicking on the tile, but he recovered quickly. The predatory light in his eyes told Leo that his brother had been waiting for an excuse, had been hungry for this moment for a very long time. Julian lunged forward. Leo tried to raise his hands defensively, but Julian was already moving. His older brother threw a heavy-handed punch that came from somewhere deep in his chest. It connected with Leo's cheekbone, and Leo's head snapped to the side. A bead of blood sprayed onto the white marble pedestal of the bust. The pain was immediate and consuming. "Weak," Julian spat, grinning that terrible grin, just like Mother always said when you were 5. Through the haze of pain, something cracked inside Leo. It wasn't thought or emotion exactly. It was something more primal. His arms wrapped around Julian's waist, and he drove forward with every ounce of strength he possessed. They crashed into a tall, heavy gold-framed mirror that had been leaning against the wall. The mirror had been there for weeks, waiting to be hung. Now it became a weapon. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged shards, and they both went down in a tangle of limbs and cutting edges. Reflections of the brothers splintered into 1,000,000 pieces as they fell. Leo scrambled up first, his hand bright with blood from a shard of glass embedded in his palm. He ignored the pain. Ignoring pain was something the Sterlings had taught him to do very well. Something lay on the floor near where Julian was sprawled, a manila envelope. In the chaos, Julian must have dropped it. Leo grabbed it, clutching it to his chest, and bolted out the front door into the rain. The storm had arrived in full force. Rain came down in sheets, soaking through his leather jacket in seconds. The gravel driveway crunched beneath his feet as he ran toward his battered silver sedan parked in the circular drive. Behind him, he could hear Julian shouting something, but the wind carried the words away. He got to his car, fumbled with the keys, and threw himself into the driver's seat. As he turned the key in the ignition, the engine coughed to life. He pulled out of the Sterling estate without looking back, the manila envelope now sitting on the passenger seat next to him. A mystery he didn't yet understand he was carrying. The rain hammered the windshield as he drove. Leo's hands shook on the steering wheel. His face throbbed where Julian had punched him. Blood trickled down from his temple where his head had met the marble. But beneath all of that physical pain was something else. Something sharper, more cutting. A need to understand. He drove to his studio apartment in the shabby part of the city, a place that was his and only his, the one space in the world where he didn't have to pretend to be someone else. Leo sat on a worn wooden chair beneath a single bare light bulb. His wet clothes clung to his skin. Water dripped from his chin onto the manila envelope as he placed it on the stained desk in front of him. The apartment was small, dominated by shelves of photography books and boxes of negatives. His camera sat on a shelf, watching him like a familiar ghost. His hands were still shaking as he tore the seal on the envelope. He slid out a stack of documents. At the top was a medical report with a blue header. Childhood Behavioral Assessment, Leo Sterling, age 6. His hands went numb as he read the first few lines. Below the report was a handwritten note in elegant script he recognized immediately as his mother's. Arthur, the doctor says the trauma from the discipline is making him withdraw. We must hide the records or the name will be tarnished. He's broken, but we can mold the pieces. The word broken was underlined twice. Leo stared at those words until they stopped making sense, until they became just shapes on paper. They didn't just ignore him. They had broken him deliberately, systematically, and then hidden the evidence of their own cruelty. A second document fell from the envelope as his hands fumbled with the stack. It was a birth certificate, older than any Leo had ever seen, printed on yellowed paper. The name at the top read, Samuel Sterling. The date of birth was 3 years before Leo's own date of birth. Stamped across the certificate in bold red letters was one word, deceased. Below the date of death, printed in black ink, drowning accident, private residence. 3 months before Leo was born. Leo felt the room tilt. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk, himself as a child, maybe 5 years old, being held by his mother. Her face was radiant. But now, looking at the birth certificate, at the dates, he understood. That radiance wasn't love. It was relief. It was the look of someone who had finally found the right replacement part. He slammed his fist onto the desk. The impact sent pens clattering to the floor. An old coffee mug shattered, its contents spreading across the wooden surface. The bare light bulb overhead flickered, once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into darkness. Leo sat in the dark for a very long time, understanding for the first time that he had never been born at all. He had been acquired, like a piece of furniture, like a work of art purchased to fill a gap in a collection. He was designed to replace a ghost, and now that ghost had served its purpose. He was expendable. The morning arrived gray and threatening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Leo had not slept. He had sat in that dark room all night, holding the documents, reading them over and over by the light of his phone, watching the words blur and refocus. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he had come to a decision. It wasn't much of a decision, really. It was more like a realization. The only power he had left was the truth. If he couldn't live with dignity in this family, at least he could die with it. But first, he needed to understand everything. The city archive was in the basement of a municipal building downtown. The air was thick with dust and age. Rows of filing cabinets stretched into darkness like monoliths in some forgotten tomb. Old Man Harris worked there, had worked there for 40 years. He had been a friend of Leo's grandmother. It was one of the few threads of connection Leo had to anything resembling the truth. Harris was an old man now, in his 80s, with thick spectacles and gnarled hands that shook slightly as he pulled Leo into his office. "Leo," Harris said, looking at the bruised and battered face of the boy who had walked through his door. "What happened to you?" "I need to know about Samuel," Leo said, "and I need to know the truth about me." Harris had hesitated for only a moment. Then he had guided Leo to the microfilm reader and inserted a reel with careful precision. The machine whirred to life, The light from the projector throwing dust particles into sharp relief, the screen flickered. An old newspaper clipping appeared, the headline in bold letters. Tragic accident at Sterling Estate. Heir apparent drowns in private pool. Below was a photograph of a young Arthur Sterling, his face devastated, his hand raised to his mouth. The boy drowned, Harris said quietly, adjusting his glasses. Samuel. He was the golden child, perfect in every way. Arthur never recovered. Neither did Eleanor. Or at least, not in the way you might think. Leo stared at the image of the pool, trying to imagine the drowning, trying to imagine the grief that would drive a man and woman to replace their child like a broken toy that had been sent out for repair. Harris turned off the reader and pulled a yellowed photograph from his vest pocket. It showed Eleanor at a hospital, but she was not pregnant, though the date stamped on the back said it was taken 2 weeks before Leo's official birth. I was there when they brought you home, Harris said, his voice like wind through dry leaves. Eleanor wasn't pregnant, Leo. You weren't born. You were adopted from an agency, a closed adoption, a secret adoption. Arthur wanted a son so desperately after Samuel died that he couldn't accept anyone else's child. He had to have one that could be shaped into Samuel, one that could be molded into the perfect heir. Leo heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away, as if Harris were speaking to him across a vast distance. I'm not even a Sterling, Leo said, and his voice sounded strange and hollow to his own ears. I'm just a project. A car door slammed somewhere outside the basement window. Leo looked up, fear spiking through him. There, outside the high window, he could see the black SUV from the parking garage, the one that had belonged to the men his father had sent to retrieve the envelope. They were here. Leo grabbed the microfilm reel and the photograph and ran for the furnace room exit. Behind him, he could hear shouting from above, the sound of men moving through the archive with purpose. He didn't look back. The subway station was crowded with the midday rush. Leo stood with his back against a tiled pillar, trying to disappear into the crowd of commuters. A vending machine nearby reflected a distorted version of his face back at him. Swollen, bleeding, barely recognizable. He didn't know this man looking back at him. Or perhaps he did. Perhaps this was the first honest reflection he'd ever seen. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out with trembling fingers. The screen was cracked, splintering lines across the glass like a map of something breaking apart. A new video message was waiting. With a sense of dread that tasted like metal, he tapped play. The video loaded. It showed his girlfriend Maya, sitting in her own apartment, the apartment Leo knew so well. She was drinking tea, unaware of any camera. She looked peaceful, beautiful, and completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. Then a hand entered the frame. Leo's breath caught in his throat. It was Julian's hand, holding a knife. The blade was close to Maya's throat, just out of her peripheral vision, the light glinting off the metal. Julian's voice came next, smooth and cold like a snake sliding across marble. Bring the files to the summer house, Leo. 1 hour, or she finds out how deep family secrets can cut. The video looped, showing the same moment over and over. Maya, peaceful and unaware. The knife. Julian's hand. The promise of violence. Leo stared at the screen as the train doors opened in front of him. The crowd around him seemed to fade away, becoming unreal and distant. All that existed was the video playing on the cracked screen, Maya's face, the blade. He didn't get on the train. Instead, he watched the doors close, watched the train accelerate into the tunnel, taking away dozens of commuters toward destinations that didn't matter. The platform emptied, until Leo stood alone in the fluorescent lighting, gripping his phone so hard the already cracked glass fractured further. He turned and ran up the stairs toward the exit. At the top, he tossed the phone into a trash can, cutting off their ability to track him. For the first time since the dinner, since the envelope, since understanding what he was, Leo felt something like clarity. It wasn't peaceful or empowering. It was cold and sharp and focused. They had taken everything from him, his identity, his mother, his future. All of it had been a carefully constructed lie meant to serve their purposes. But they had forgotten one thing. He had been trained his entire life to survive in their world. He knew how they thought. He knew how they moved. He knew their cruelty because they had been his primary teachers, and now they had given him something to fight for. The Sterling summer house sat on a hillside overlooking a private valley, a monument to glass and modern architecture. It was meant to be a refuge, but it looked to Leo like a cage made from windows instead of bars. He arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The storm had passed, and the day had cleared into brilliant sunshine. The light reflected off the glass walls, creating a dazzling display that made it impossible to see inside clearly. But Leo could see enough. Maya was tied to a designer chair in the living room, a gag across her mouth. Her eyes were wide with fear, but when she saw him, they filled with a mixture of relief and confusion. Julian stood over her with a fireplace poker, his expression one of controlled anticipation. The guards, the same men from the parking garage, stood by the doors, watching, waiting. Leo stepped inside. "Did you bring the papers?" Julian asked, his voice full of mockery. "Or should I start with the furniture?" Leo pulled the envelope from inside his jacket. It was the manila envelope he had taken from the fight in the foyer, the one he had carried all this time. He held it up so they could see it clearly. Then he threw it into the roaring fireplace. The envelope caught immediately, the flames licking up the edges of the paper, consuming the documents within. Julian screamed, an actual scream of rage and desperation, and lunged for the fire as if he could somehow pull out the burning papers and save them. It was in that moment of distraction that Thug 1 attacked Leo with a baton. Leo blocked with his forearm, feeling the impact shudder through his arm, but he didn't let it slow him down. He pivoted on his heel and drove his foot upward in a clean, precise kick that connected with the thug's groin. The man dropped like a stone. Julian spun away from the fireplace, his face contorted with rage. He gripped the fireplace poker and swung it at Leo's head with all the strength he possessed. The poker cut through the air with a sound like a scythe, but Leo ducked beneath it. The poker continued its arc and connected with a 10,000 crystal vase on the mantelpiece instead. The vase shattered into fragments. Water and flowers spilled across the expensive rug, spreading like a stain that no amount of money could clean. Julian was past thinking now, past strategy. He was pure fury, pure violence. He swung the poker again, this time aiming for Leo's midsection. Leo sidestepped and grabbed Julian's wrist, using his brother's own momentum against him. They grappled, their bodies straining against each other, and Leo drove his brother backward. They crashed through a set of sliding glass doors. The world exploded into shards. They tumbled out onto the stone patio, rolling through fragments of glass, and Leo felt the sharp edges cutting into his skin, drawing blood. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except this moment, except finally pushing back against the force that had been crushing him his entire life. Julian managed to pin Leo down against the hard stone. Then he began punching. 1, 2, 3. The impacts came rapid fire. Julian's fists connecting with Leo's face again and again. Leo's eyes rolled back, and he felt his consciousness starting to slip away into darkness. His vision blurred, becoming a kaleidoscope of colors and pain. That was when the gun appeared. Thug 2 stood above them, pointing a 9mm pistol at the side of Leo's head. The barrel was steady, unwavering. Julian paused mid-punch, both brothers breathing hard, both covered in blood and dirt. "You were always meant to be discarded," Julian said, his voice hoarse from exertion and rage. "Today is the day." Then a black sedan pulled up the driveway. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately, as if its driver had all the time in the world. The door opened, and an Arthur Sterling stepped out, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane. He walked toward the scene on the patio with the careful, measured steps of a man in complete control. His expression was absolutely impassive. Arthur observed the bloody scene before him with the detached interest of a man watching insects in a specimen case. He gestured once, a small movement of his hand, and Thug 2 lowered the gun. Leo looked up at his father, and for a moment, hope flickered in his chest. He reached out a trembling hand, thinking perhaps there was some limit to the cruelty, some boundary that even Arthur Sterling would not cross. Arthur looked at the hand as if it were a piece of rotting meat. Then he leaned down to whisper something in Leo's ear, something that only he could hear. And now that experiment had failed. Arthur gestured to Thug 2. The gun came back up. "Clean this up," Arthur said. And then he turned and walked back toward the sedan without looking back even once. The thugs grabbed Leo by the armpits and hauled him up. His legs wouldn't support his weight, so they simply dragged him, his toes furrowing the dirt as they pulled him toward the heavy iron cellar door in the side of the house. He tried to look at Maya, tried to meet her eyes one last time, but she was being forced into the sedan, her gag still in place, tears streaming down her face. Julian smirked at him one final time before slamming the car door shut. The black sedan drove away down the driveway, carrying Maya into whatever fate the Sterlings had planned for her. Leo watched it disappear, understanding in that moment that he had not only failed to save himself, he had failed to save the one person he had come back here to protect. The thugs threw him down the concrete stairs into the cellar. He hit the bottom hard, his shoulder connecting with the edge of the lowest step. He felt the joint dislocate with a sickening pop, bones separating from socket with a sensation of something fundamental breaking. The pain was beyond anything Leo had ever experienced. It consumed everything, every thought, every hope, every prayer he might have offered, if he still believed in prayers. The cellar door slammed shut above him with a heavy bang. The lock engaged with a metallic click. Leo lay on the damp dirt floor in absolute darkness. He could smell rot and old wine, a combination that turned his stomach. The space was silent except for the sound of water dripping somewhere in the blackness, each drop hitting stone with a hollow plink that seemed to echo like a clock marking the passage of time. His shoulders screamed in agony. His face was a landscape of pain. His ribs felt like they might be broken. And somewhere above him, the world continued on, indifferent to his suffering, as the Sterling family went about the business of erasing him from existence. He pulled his knees up to his chest, curled into a ball on the dirt, and understood, truly understood for the first time, that this was the end. There was no escape. There was no redemption. There was no moment where everything would somehow make sense, and he would find his footing and overcome. This was simply the final expression of a truth that had been present his entire life. He was nothing. He was meant to be nothing. A replacement for a ghost. A project that had failed. A boy who should never have existed in the first place. He felt something in his pocket, the small Swiss Army knife he'd grabbed from the parking garage, the one with the heavy metal casing that had served him as a weapon against the thugs. His fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment he considered taking the blade out and ending it himself, taking control of the one thing he had never been able to control, his own ending. But as he held the knife, something stirred inside him. It was small, almost insignificant, just the faintest spark of defiance. Not hope. He wasn't foolish enough to believe in hope. But something else. Stubbornness, perhaps. Or simply the refusal to give them the satisfaction of finding his body in this cellar tomorrow morning, ready to add him to their collection of secrets. Leo stood, his shoulders screaming in protest. He moved to the brick wall and, using his feet for leverage against the wall, he forced his dislocated shoulder back into place. The movement was violent and agonizing. He let out a suppressed scream that seemed to echo off the cellar walls, a sound of such profound pain that it didn't seem possible for a human body to produce it. But he did it. He could feel the joint click back into place, bone sliding back against bone, the pain switching from one type of agony to a different type of agony. It was still broken, still damaged, but at least it was back where it belonged. Then he looked around the dark cellar. There, nearly invisible in the shadows, he could see the shape of an old coal chute. It was a relic from when the house had been heated by coal, decades old, sealed shut but not locked. The hinges were on the inside, made of old iron but nothing that wouldn't respond to pressure and patience. Leo pulled out the Swiss Army knife and opened the small blade. Then he began to work. It was slow, tedious work. His fingers were slick with blood, and the small blade kept slipping. But Leo had learned patience in the Sterling family. He had learned how to sit still and endure. He had learned how to do small, meticulous work for hours, without complaint or distraction. All the skills that had been trained into him to make him useful could now be applied to the task of saving his own life. The first screw turned, then the second. By the time he had removed all the hinges, his hands were cramping and his shoulder was throbbing with a dull ache that made him nauseous. But when he pushed on the chute door, it fell inward with a quiet creak. He crawled up into the narrow tunnel. The space was tight, barely wide enough for him to fit through, and absolutely filled with decades of accumulated soot and coal dust. His jacket tore as he pushed through, the fabric catching on a jagged piece of metal. But he kept moving, kept pushing, kept crawling through the blackness until finally, his head emerged into the cool evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Birds were singing their evening songs, indifferent to the suffering of human beings. Leo pulled himself out of the coal chute and collapsed on the soft grass behind the summer house, gasping for air, coughing out black soot. For several minutes, he simply lay there, unable to do anything but breathe. But he was alive. The black SUV was parked near the gate, one of the guards leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette. The man didn't notice Leo crawling through the grass behind him, staying low and moving carefully. The guard was watching the road, watching for any sign of trouble from outside, never thinking to look behind the house. On the back seat of the SUV, through the slightly open window, Leo could see his camera. His professional camera, the one his father had confiscated, the tool of his one true skill. It was sitting there like a prize, or perhaps like bait. Leo didn't try for it. Not yet. Instead, he made his way to the garage and found a set of keys hanging on a hook by the door. A gardener's truck, old and beat up but functional. He took the keys and slipped into the driver's seat. The engine turned over with a cough and a sputter, but it started. He drove slowly out of the gates of the summer house, keeping the truck low in the garden beds until he was clear of the property. The guard never looked up from his cigarette. It took Leo 3 hours to reach the Sterling estate. The grand mansion sat on its hill like a monument to dynastic power, all stone and iron and carefully manicured gardens. But as Leo approached, using the truck to blend in with the evening deliveries, he could see police cars beginning to gather at the bottom of the drive. Sirens wailed in the distance. The live stream, the one that had been broadcasting to 100,000 people. The authorities were responding. Leo didn't care about the police. The police would arrest Arthur eventually. The police would find the records and the evidence and build their case. Justice, cold and procedural, would unfold over months and years, courts and lawyers and plea deals. But that wasn't what Leo needed. He parked the truck and made his way into the main house through the service entrance. The halls were chaos. Servants were running back and forth, terrified staff members trying to figure out what was happening. A man had attempted to broadcast the Sterling family's secrets to the entire internet. The police were coming. The end of an era was beginning. No one stopped Leo as he walked through the corridors. Arthur's office was on the second floor, a room of mahogany and leather and old power. Arthur was there, sitting behind his massive desk, signing documents with a fountain pen, as if the world outside his room wasn't collapsing. Julian was there too, pouring himself a drink from a crystal decanter, his hands shaking slightly. And in the corner, tied to a chair, was Maya. Leo stepped into the room. He was holding his camera, the one he had retrieved from the SUV after taking out the guard with a rock to the head. The camera that had been his father's weapon and was now about to become his own. Arthur looked up from his papers with an expression of profound boredom. "You're like a cockroach, Leo," his father said. "Hard to crush." Leo raised the camera and positioned it so the lens was aimed at the three of them. His finger went to the shutter. "You're right about one thing," Leo said, and his voice was steady and calm. "The project is hard to crush, but maybe that's because it was never really your project at all." He turned the camera screen around so they could see it. It showed a live stream. The icon in the corner displayed the viewer count. It was climbing. 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people were watching. The live feed from the camera was broadcasting to every corner of the internet, a real-time record of the Sterling family's final moments, with no way to stop it, no kill switch to flip, no way to contain the truth now that it was out in the world. "I'm not here to fight you, Arthur," Leo said. "I'm here to show the world exactly what you are. The project is finally telling its own story." Julian lunged toward him. Leo simply stepped aside. His brother, propelled by his own momentum, tripped over his own feet and crashed into the desk. The impact knocked over the crystal decanter of whiskey, spilling amber liquid across the expensive contracts spread out before them. The ink from an overturned well joined the whiskey, creating a black stain that spread across the papers like spilled blood. The Sterling logo, that carefully protected symbol of family and legacy, was drowning in the mess. The police came an hour later. They arrested Arthur Sterling at his desk and Julian as he tried to escape through the garden. They found Maya and cut her bonds. They discovered the files, the real files, hidden in a safe in Arthur's private study, and they took them as evidence. But Leo was already gone. He and Maya walked down the long gravel driveway of the Sterling estate as the sun sank below the horizon. Behind them, police cars blocked the entrance, their lights painting the evening in shades of blue and red. Sirens wailed, approaching from every direction, converging on the house like vultures circling a dying animal. The storm clouds were gathering again on the horizon, threatening rain before the night was through. "Was it worth it?" Maya asked softly. Leo pulled a small microchip from his pocket. It was what he had actually stolen from the safe. The real safe, hidden behind a false panel in Arthur's office. Not the documents about his adoption, not the records of his childhood abuse. Something else entirely. The microchip contained access to every transaction, every offshore account, every secret payment the Sterling family had made over decades. It was worth more than the adoption records. It was worth more than the evidence of abuse. It was worth more than photographs or testimony. It was proof. Leo pulled out a tablet that he had taken from the summer house. He opened a final file, one that had been encrypted and hidden, one that his mother had left for him to find someday. Though perhaps she had never expected that someday would come like this. It was a video. Eleanor appeared on the screen. His mother,